In the final decades of Queen Victoria's long reign, when England seemed wrapped in a hush of propriety and unspoken yearning, the Wexford estate loomed like a quiet monument to both privilege and sorrow. Its grand corridors echoed less with footsteps than with memories, and its polished windows reflected a duke who had learned to carry his grief with the silent discipline expected of his rank. Edmund Harroway, the 31-year-old Duke of Wexford, wore his loneliness like a well-tailored coat, visible only to those who cared enough to look closely. Most did not. Society preferred a man of his stature to remain dignified, predictable, and untouchably composed. And so he was, except in the hour just after dawn, when he walked alone into the rose garden his late wife had loved, seeking solace beneath the iron arbor where no one could demand anything of him. It was here, on a mist-drenched morning, that a quiet thread of fate pulled a new presence into his weary orbit. Miss Eleanor Hargrave had arrived at Wexford only the day before, carrying a modest valise and the kind of posture that spoke of careful upbringing rather than wealth. At 24, she had already learned how easily the world dismissed a woman whose lineage lacked grandeur. Her employment as companion to Lady Beatrice Harroway, the Duke's frail aunt, had been secured through a distant family acquaintance, and though the arrangement promised stability, it offered no protection from scrutiny. Aristocratic tongues, ever eager for something to sharpen themselves upon, had taken swift notice of her arrival. Before she had even removed her gloves, 2 visiting ladies whispered that she looked like a governess pretending to be a gentlewoman. The words, dropped carelessly in the foyer, were overheard, repeated, reshaped, and carried through the estate like drifting embers. Eleanor had pretended not to hear. She had grown accustomed to such judgments, yet the sting never fully dulled. All she wanted, truly, was a place where her quiet competence would be enough, where her sincerity might not be mistaken for ambition. But at Wexford, even sincerity could be a liability. Still, she moved through her duties with careful precision, tending to Lady Beatrice's needs with the soft steadiness of someone who understood fragility. When the older woman asked for her shawl on that misty morning, Eleanor went searching through the east wing, unaware that her path would lead her to the estate's most private wound. The garden air felt colder than the corridors she had left behind, its silence broken only by the distant call of a lark and the faint drip of last night's rain slipping from rose petals. As she stepped onto the stone path, the sight before her made her pause, not out of fear, but from the sudden recognition of a sorrow so profound it softened the world around it. The Duke sat slumped beneath the frost-kissed arch of the arbor, his usually immaculate posture undone by the weight of unspoken loss. His head was bowed, one hand pressed to his forehead, the other loosely holding a letter he seemed unable to open. He did not hear her approach. The garden's stillness held him too tightly. Eleanor could have turned back. Every rule of propriety demanded she do so. No servant, no companion, no gentlewoman of modest means should interrupt a grieving duke without invitation. Yet something in the tremor of his breath, the defeated tilt of his shoulders, stirred a courage she did not know she possessed. She thought of Lady Beatrice's frailty, of the whispered cruelty in the foyer, and of the world's casual readiness to wound those already suffering. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped softly closer. "Don't cry, sir. You are not alone anymore." The words escaped her in a whisper scarcely louder than the rustling leaves. For a heartbeat she feared she had overstepped beyond forgiveness. But then the Duke lifted his head, his eyes, storm-gray and hollowed by months of mourning, fixed on her with a mixture of surprise and bewildering vulnerability. No aristocrat, no statesman, no polished figure of rank, just a man startled by the discovery that someone had seen him fall apart. Eleanor reached into her pocket and extended a simple white handkerchief. She expected him to refuse, as any well-trained nobleman might. Instead, he accepted it with a quiet, pained gratitude that disarmed them both. His fingers brushed hers, accidentally, gently, and though the touch lasted scarcely a moment, it carried a warmth more startling than the morning air. She lowered her gaze at once, as if contact itself were a forbidden luxury. Before either of them spoke again, a rustle sounded from the colonnade. Mrs. Alderton, the housekeeper, stood half-hidden behind a pillar, her expression unreadable. She dipped her head in polite acknowledgment, yet lingered a breath too long, long enough to witness the fragile tableau, long enough for misinterpretation to begin. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, a flicker of dread rising in her chest. The Duke, noticing the retreat, straightened his posture, restoring his accustomed air of command, though his eyes still carried the trace of a man newly unmasked. "You have my thanks, Miss Hargrave," he said quietly, each syllable controlled but sincere. "Your kindness is not misplaced." She curtsied, willing her voice to remain steady. "I merely wish to be of service, my lord." A faint, almost imperceptible shift passed over his features, something like relief, or perhaps recognition. For a moment, the garden seemed to breathe with them, but then she remembered the whispers from the previous day, the scrutiny she already faced, and the precariousness of her position. The Duke could withstand gossip, she could not. She stepped back another pace, restoring the proper distance between them. "If you have no further need of me, sir, I should attend to Lady Beatrice." He nodded, though his gaze followed her longer than decorum allowed. As Eleanor walked away, her heart beat with a confused mixture of fear and an inexplicable tenderness she dared not name. Unbeknownst to her, the Duke remained beneath the arbor long after she vanished into the mist. He glanced down at the handkerchief, embroidered only with simple stitching, and closed his hand around it as though holding a lifeline. He had not expected kindness that morning. He had not expected to feel anything at all. By midday, whispers had already begun circling the estate. The Duke had been seen in a compromising state, and Miss Hargrave had been involved. Misinterpreted fragments replaced truth. Speculation bloomed where compassion had taken root. And while Eleanor worked beside Lady Beatrice with measured grace, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the drawing room, the Duke summoned a quiet resolve. He requested that Eleanor be brought to his study for a matter of importance. When the message reached her, her pulse quickened with dread. She was certain her moment of compassion had become her undoing, and as she walked toward the study's heavy oak doors, unaware of the decision waiting behind them, the estate seemed to hold its breath, ready to shift the course of both their lives. Eleanor paused outside the heavy oak door of the Duke's study, her fingers lightly brushing the brass handle, a tremor of anxiety coursing through her. The previous morning's garden encounter, though brief, lingered in both of their minds with a weight neither dared to name. Edmund had summoned her now with a tone that balanced authority and unspoken urgency, and she could not predict whether she would be reproached or, astonishingly, welcomed. Drawing a slow breath, she entered, the muted sunlight from the tall windows casting long patterns across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of cedar and parchment, and for a heartbeat she saw only the enormity of his presence, tall, impeccably dressed, with a measured dignity that both intimidated and, in its quiet depth, invited. He looked up from a ledger, his sharp features softened by the rare hint of a smile. "Miss Hargrave," he said, his voice even yet warmer than she expected. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please sit." She obeyed, lowering herself onto the high-backed chair with cautious grace. The room, lined with books and heavy drapes, felt both confining and intimate, the contrast amplifying her sense of vulnerability. Edmund set aside the ledger and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. There was a deliberate calm in his posture, yet the flicker of curiosity in his eyes betrayed a man accustomed to control, now navigating something unfamiliar. "I wish to return this to you," he said, lifting a small, neatly folded handkerchief, the same one from the garden. The embroidery gleamed subtly in the soft light. "I thought it best cleaned and perhaps more fitting to your taste." Eleanor's hands went immediately to her lap, her cheeks coloring. A gift in the Victorian sense carried weight far beyond the material. It was acknowledgment, attention, and a subtle claim of regard. She dared not meet his gaze fully. "I thank you, my lord," she murmured, voice barely audible. "It is most kind." He inclined his head slightly, the corner of his mouth hinting at amusement. "Kindness is not merely habit, Miss Hargrave. It is a choice, and it should be recognized as such." They spoke then with careful civility, yet the air between them hummed with a tension neither had anticipated. Each word, each pause, was laden with a delicate intimacy, yet framed in the careful restraint demanded by their stations. Eleanor's mind was a quiet storm, torn between propriety and the unspoken comfort she felt in his presence. She noticed, almost reluctantly, the lines of grief softened at his temples, the subtle shadow that lingered beneath his eyes, a map of loss that mirrored her own private battles. It was in these quiet observations that connection began to root, tender yet undeniable. Days passed with the rhythm of estate life, carrying with it moments that seemed inconsequential to any observer, but monumental to them. Eleanor assisted Lady Beatrice in organizing correspondence, guiding her through letters from charitable patrons and tenants alike. Edmund would sometimes appear, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, yet linger just long enough to comment on her careful attention to detail, or to share a remark from one of the tenant families. Their conversations, though restrained, grew in depth. A shared glance at a child's drawing or a quiet remark about the frost on the garden hedges carried more weight than the most elaborate social pleasantries. In these moments, the barriers of station and expectation seemed to dissolve, leaving only two people navigating the delicate terrain of grief, respect, and unvoiced desire. Yet society, with its relentless scrutiny, would not allow such tenderness to remain unnoticed. On an afternoon when Eleanor delivered papers to the Duke in the conservatory, a visiting baroness paused in the doorway, observing the Duke bending slightly to retrieve a dropped quill. In another age, such a gesture would have been trivial, but in the rigidly codified society of the late 1800s, it was twisted into speculation. Whispers followed Eleanor through the halls, murmurs of favoritism, impropriety, and the audacity of a companion to command attention from a duke. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of judgment pressing upon her, yet there was no reproof in Edmund's eyes when she returned the next day. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgment, a subtle shield against a world eager to assign scandal where none existed. He continued to offer small, deliberate gestures that spoke volumes to someone attuned to nuance. A volume of Tennyson, bound in simple leather, yet chosen with evident care, appeared on her desk, a note tucked within. For the solace of a thoughtful mind, D.W. Eleanor held it, tracing the letters with fingers that betrayed both delight and apprehension. A gift, she reminded herself, must be received with careful propriety, yet she could not deny the warmth that coursed through her chest. It was a language of understanding without words, of recognition without expectation, a connection that dared to exist within the strictures of their world. One evening, as winter's chill pressed against the tall windows and rain tapped insistently upon the glass, Eleanor sought to return a letter to the conservatory, unaware that the Duke had entered from the opposite side. Lanterns hung in quiet pairs, casting golden pools of light that flickered against the crystal and brass. The conservatory smelled faintly of damp earth and jasmine, an intoxicating blend softened by candle wax. Their eyes met across the room, a silent acknowledgment of presence, yet neither moved immediately. Conversation began with measured politeness, words about the weather, about Lady Beatrice's comfort, about mundane matters of estate management. Yet beneath the surface, an unspoken dialogue unfolded. Grief met compassion, distance met curiosity, caution met tentative trust. Edmund's voice softened, betraying an emotion carefully restrained. "Miss Hargrave, in your presence, I find a certain peace, a calm I thought long lost." Eleanor's breath caught. Her response, though composed, revealed the tremor she felt. "I am grateful to be of service, my lord, though I fear my assistance is of little significance." The Duke's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. "It is of great significance, more than words may convey." The silence that followed was neither uncomfortable nor empty. It was filled with possibility, a shared recognition of two lives touching, carefully, at the edges of propriety and longing. Yet the world beyond their secluded spaces continued its inexorable scrutiny. By the following morning, Eleanor discovered a letter from Lady Beatrice, its tone courteous, yet tinged with concern. Certain guests, it seemed, had remarked upon her proximity to the Duke, suggesting impropriety where none existed. The words threatened the tenuous security she had established. Fear rose within her, not of Edmund, who had shown only respect, but of the society whose judgment could be as lethal as any dagger. She packed a small bag, preparing to leave the estate quietly, believing that discretion demanded her departure before scandal could take root. Meanwhile, Edmund discovered the same letter, folded neatly among his morning correspondence. His eyes, normally so composed, darkened with a mixture of anger and resolve. He read and reread the words, considering the implications not for himself, but for her, the woman who had dared to offer kindness, who had seen him unguarded, who had, without intent, stirred the fragile bloom of hope within his heart. Without a word to anyone, he rose, drawing his coat around him against the chill of the estate halls, and made his way toward the east wing, where Eleanor prepared to leave. The quiet determination in his step, the unspoken urgency in his bearing, spoke louder than any proclamation. He would not allow her to vanish under the weight of society's judgment. As the sun dipped behind the frost-tinged trees, casting long shadows across the estate lawns, Eleanor stood at the threshold of her carriage, heart clenched with dread and expectation. The moment stretched taut with possibility. Then, from the misted path beyond the east wing, a figure emerged, resolute and unmistakable. Edmund's eyes, unwavering and resolute, found hers. The weight of unspoken words pressed upon them both. In that instant, time seemed suspended. An entire world contained within a glance, a single step, a fragile hope that dared to resist convention. The morning mist hung low over Wexford Estate, curling around the rose arbor where so many quiet moments had begun, as if the garden itself held its breath in anticipation. Eleanor stood near the edge of the path, her small valise in hand, fingers trembling despite the layers of wool that shielded her from the chill. She had decided, after nights of sleepless thought, that propriety demanded her departure. The whispers of scandal, however baseless, had traveled faster than any messenger, and she feared the consequences of remaining, even under the Duke's protection. The air was crisp, scented faintly with frost and damp earth, carrying the distant sound of the carriage wheels on gravel. She had rehearsed her exit in her mind countless times, yet each imagined step now felt impossibly heavy. From the shadowed path, Edmund emerged, his coat dark against the soft light, boots crisp on the dew-laden grass. His presence alone seemed to make the estate pause, to hush the murmuring birds and the gentle rustle of leaves. He carried no fanfare, no declaration, only the quiet authority of a man who had resolved that kindness and courage were worth more than social censure. His eyes, storm-gray and unwavering, found hers instantly. Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had not anticipated being confronted with the intensity of his gaze, nor the depth of the emotion it conveyed. For a moment, words failed them both. The frost glimmered along the arbor, delicate and fleeting, like the fragile hope now pulsing between them. "Miss Hargrave," he began, his voice steady yet rich with urgency, "did you truly believe I would allow the weight of gossip to dictate your departure?" The sound of her name on his lips was both grounding and disarming. Eleanor's heart thudded against her ribcage. Her hand tightened around the valise handle. "My lord, the letters," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "They warn. I have read them," he interrupted gently, stepping closer, so that the space between them shrank without violating decorum. "And I have considered them fully. Yet they mean nothing in comparison to what is right. And what is right, Miss Hargrave, is that you remain here." His words, deliberate and unwavering, carried a weight that silenced her fears, yet left room for the unspoken, for the tender vulnerability neither dared articulate aloud. The garden seemed to exhale with them, the mist curling around their feet, softening edges and shadows alike. Eleanor lowered her gaze, cheeks warmed by more than the cold. I never wished to impose," she murmured, her voice trembling, "nor to burden you with familiarity that society deems improper." Edmund's hand, when he extended it, was not demanding, but a bridge offered across the chasm of expectation and fear. "You have done nothing but bring light where there was shadow," he said, eyes softened by the memory of grief endured alone. "You have reminded me that even the most restrained heart can still feel." The sincerity of his words struck her profoundly. The rigid walls she had built around her own heart faltered, and she allowed herself a single, trembling step closer. Their dialogue, restrained yet potent, unfolded like the slow bloom of a winter rose. He spoke of grief and resilience, of loneliness mitigated by trust, and of the rare courage it took to offer kindness in a world quick to condemn. Eleanor responded with humility and honesty, recounting small acts of care that had brought her solace even as she served Lady Beatrice. With each exchange, the air grew charged, a tension not born of impropriety, but of shared understanding, of two lives poised delicately on the edge of connection. For all the silent pressures of society beyond the garden walls, here, they were simply two human beings, exposed and unguarded, their hearts meeting in quiet defiance of expectation. The estate, so accustomed to the predictable rhythms of duty, seemed momentarily suspended, as though acknowledging the significance of this meeting. In the distance, the sound of the carriage wheels faded, the world's gossip held at bay by the sanctuary of mist and frost. Edmund's voice dropped lower, softer, yet imbued with compelling earnestness. "Eleanor, I would not permit fear of opinion to sever what is true between us. I cannot, and will not, allow you to leave." Eleanor's throat constricted with emotion. She had feared reprisal, disapproval, and yet here he was, shielding her not only from scandal, but from the uncertainty that had haunted her since her arrival. The magnitude of his resolve struck her to the core. She felt a warmth bloom inside her chest, fragile and startling, a fragile assurance that perhaps, for the first time, she was seen without pretense or judgment. As the sun struggled through the mist, golden beams cutting paths through the soft gray, Edmund gestured toward the arbor under which their acquaintance had begun. "It was here, in this very garden, that you first offered me solace," he said quietly, "and it is here that I wish to make it clear. Your presence matters to me, not for what society may whisper, but for what is true and certain." Eleanor's hands, now empty of her valise, clutched one another, her pulse quickened by the weight of honesty and emotion conveyed so simply, yet profoundly. She wanted to speak, to assure him, yet words faltered, inadequate to the depth she felt. Instead, she allowed her eyes to meet his, a silent acknowledgment of shared understanding and unspoken hope. The following days were marked by deliberate courage. At a formal gathering in the estate's great hall, Edmund stood before assembled guests, composed yet resolute, his voice carried across the polished marble, firm and unwavering. "Miss Hargrave has demonstrated grace, intelligence, and a steadfast spirit deserving of recognition, not rumor. I value her presence in this household, and any judgment contrary to that is misplaced." The room fell silent, guests exchanging glances of surprise and admiration. Eleanor, observing discreetly from a corner, felt both pride and relief swell within her. In that public affirmation, the private tension that had defined their relationship gave way to acknowledgment that their connection could exist openly, even amid scrutiny. Lady Beatrice, frail yet sharp-eyed, summoned Eleanor to her chamber shortly thereafter. Her voice, though quiet, carried unmistakable warmth. "You have brought my nephew a light I feared lost to him forever," she said, clasping Eleanor's hands. "Remain here, child. The estate, and he, requires the goodness you embody." Eleanor's eyes glistened, gratitude and quiet triumph mingling with relief. Even within the careful constraints of duty, she felt a measure of belonging, sanctioned by the one whose blessing mattered most. Winter's chill persisted, yet the garden no longer seemed austere or forbidding. Edmund and Eleanor walked its frost-lined paths, the air rich with the scent of earth and roses, their steps measured yet intimate. Conversation flowed with ease now, touching on literature, estate matters, and the shared history of loss and resilience. Their connection, nurtured through small gestures, quiet attentiveness, and moments of unspoken understanding, had found both acknowledgment and safety. Each glance, each word, carried the weight of affection and the promise of companionship. Finally, beneath the arbor where their acquaintance had first flickered to life, Edmund knelt with the deliberate decorum befitting his rank, though his voice betrayed a tremor of emotion. "Eleanor," he said, "I offer not only my name, but my enduring respect and companionship. May I have the honor of your hand, not as a duty, but as a choice freely given?" Eleanor, breath caught in her chest, responded with a smile that bridged propriety and feeling. "I have never sought more than your happiness, sir, but I accept with all my heart." Their hands met, a connection tender yet resolute, the culmination of cautious courage and mutual trust. Even as the frost sparkled in the morning sun, promising warmth to come, a shadow lingered on the horizon. Society's gaze remained, poised with potential judgment, and the Duke's world of duty and expectation was far from extinguished. Yet within the quiet resolve of the garden, amid the mist and winter light, two hearts had found each other, undaunted, steadfast, and ready to face whatever tides of convention might follow.